Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Amy. Todos sean bienvenidos a esta sección. Thank you for joining today's session. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, I keep talking. Okay, so the session is Leading for Engagement, Cultural Competence Practice to Engage People from Diverse Community and Background. Today, we will explore the National Center for Cultural Competence Values and Guidance Principle for Community Engagement. And we will also learn about strategies and approaches for engaging diverse communities. I am pleased to present to you our speaker today. Many of you probably know her. It's Tawara Goode. I will introduce Tawara in Spanish, so please select the English interpretation channel. Thank you. Tawara Goode es la directora del Centro Nacional para la Competencia Cultural. I guess I really okay, I keep talking. Okay. So, la directora del Centro Nacional para la Competencia Cultural del Centro de Desarrollo Infantil y Desarrollo Humano. Is some background in English right now, so I don't know if everybody hearing that.
People can choose to mute the original audio and then they'll only hear English translation if they want.
Okay, to make sure that, thank you, Amy. So let's say that Tawara se desempeña como directora del Centro Universitario de Excelencia en Discapacidades en Desarrollo y dirige sus esfuerzos en promover y sostener y ampliar el conocimiento y el quehacer de la competencia cultural y lingüística a nivel español, a nivel nacional. Es catedrática asociada en el Departamento de Pediatría del Centro Médico de la Universidad de Georgetown. La profesora Goode es reconocida como un líder intelectual en competencia cultural y lingüística. Convirtiendo al Centro Nacional para la Competencia Cultural en un programa galardonado y reconocido a nivel nacional e internacional. La profesora Tawara Goode participa activamente en el desarrollo e implementación de programas e iniciativas en el área de competencia cultural y lingüística a nivel local, nacional e internacional. Así que le damos toda la bienvenida a Tawara Goode. Welcome, Tawara.
Thank you, Luz. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I am thrilled to be here today and I think it's like with 136 participants, there's quite a few, to be able to share with you ongoing work in which we've been engaged and I would just say some things that we'd like to share with councils. With that said, I am going to share screen and bring up my slides. So pretty long title that we have today, Culturally and Linguistically Competent Strategies to Engage Diverse Communities. And while I've given this presentation many times, I always adapt it to the audience. So for this, we're really looking at this within the context of developmental disabilities councils. I forgot to give a visual description. Let's see, I would describe myself as rich brown skin. I'm wearing a blue top and my favorite necklace that was a gift to me in honor of my son. I have on a blue blouse and blue glasses and you can't see it, but I have on yoga pants. I'm just like really dressed from the top up here. So I have my hair in natural. So that would be, I don't know, pretty average description of myself. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with our slides. we have a lot to do today, and I wanted to be able to share as many things with you as possible, and also for you to have a chance to interact, ask questions, and to hear from two of your colleagues. So today we're going to look at national demographic trends. And as I share those trends with you, I want you to be able to think about what it looks like in your respective states and or territories. We are going to define cultural competence or review a definition of cultural competence and linguistic competence, just to make sure that we understand these frameworks, because we're talking about applying those to community engagement. We will differentiate community engagement and community outreach. We will also look at the concept of historical trauma and how it affects persons who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities, their families, and the communities in which they live, which is really very important as we're thinking about engaging diverse communities. We will look at the concept of cultural brokering and how it can be used to engage diverse communities. And lastly, I will share with you 6 strategies. There's 6 approaches that reflect cultural and linguistic competence in terms of engaging diverse communities. And we'll hear from 2 of your colleagues and regarding how they indeed may use these concepts and apply it to a scenario. So we have a lot of things we're going to do today. So we're going to just start out by really looking at and this is the top 10 countries of origin in 2022 of persons who obtain lawful permanent resident status overall. And I just got, all right, are you able to hear me? I just got a note that said my internet is unstable. Is everything still okay on screen? All right, I'm hoping I don't see that flash up on my screen again. And yeah, all right. So this is looking at these various countries of origin overall. And I think if we look at those top 10, they may look very different in your respective states or territories. But every year, the US Census provides this data for us. And so I think it's very important as we think about engaging diverse communities. There are new members of communities that enter into our various states and communities every year. And having, say, a finger on the pulse of that is very important. Another demographic that I'm sharing with you, and this is the most recent demographic data that we have overall, is that as we think about these categories and percentages as are depicted on this slide, I really want to focus on 2 in particular. The category is some other race, and clearly in the US, just under 25 million folks self-identify as some other race, meaning that white, African American, or Black, American Indian, or Alaska Native, none of those identities refer to themselves, and they think of themselves in some other way. So as we look at that, we would have to ask councils, how are they able to collect such data? How are they understanding persons who self-identify in this way? And the other category of 2 or more races, which we had 41+ million people who self-identify as 2 or more races. We also know from the data that 2 or more races is one of the fastest growing categories of people who are living in the US and also in our territories. So these are things to think about, and also think about, well, what does this look like in my given state? I also wanted to share with you just some data on languages. We are a language-rich nation, as you can see, that's depicted here on the slide. And you can access this data, or you may already know this data for your state. And if we look at the overall percentages, we're currently doing work in New York, we've done work in California, that those percentages indeed look different depending on the geographic locale. One category I'll call your attention to is other languages. And if you look there, excuse me, that there are Navajo, Native American languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and then lumping all African languages together so that really being able to tease that out is also going to be very important. What I always like to highlight in terms of these data is the concept of limited English-speaking households. It used to be referred to as linguistic isolation. Unfortunately, U.S. Census chose to change that term. And these are households in any state. This slide is depicting the entire U.S., in which nobody in the household that's over age 14 speaks a non-English language very well and overall. And so as we think about that, that is really significant when we're looking at families and relatives and persons who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities, that this is really key and critical, really understanding the language capacity within your state. So we have Spanish here, but all of the language categories I had before, again, is lumped into a category of Indo-European languages, Asian and Pacific Island languages, and other languages. And again, this looks very different per state and is essential information if we're looking at engaging diverse communities. We also look at these data, and it's looking at persons who experience disabilities by race and ethnicity, and also by age. This is one of the few data sources that we have. It's collected by the U.S. Census Bureau, but it does not specifically collect data on intellectual and developmental disabilities. You see the categories there: hearing, vision, cognitive, ambulatory, self-care, and living independently, and by age groupings. And again, this may look very different in your state and or territory, but having an idea of the distribution of disability across these areas is really key and critical going forward. So I'm going to ask this question, and then someone's going to pull up a question for us. Do you know who lives in your state or territory by race? Answers are yes, no, not sure. By ethnicity, yes, no, not sure. And also by languages spoken, yes, no, not sure. If you could please respond. Also, gathering this data will help ITAC overall, just in terms of the kind of technical assistance they can provide to councils.
Tawara, you can just let me know when you want to close the poll, and I can show the results on the screen if you'd like.
How about you tell me like how many people are responding, because on my screen I only say 03 answered.
71% so far.
All right, do you think we should get to 75%?
Sure.
Okay. Are we there yet?
Yep. We got
Okay,
a little.
all right. All right, so if you can share this on screen. All right. And so do you know who lives in your state by your state or territory by race? 70% are saying yes. We still have folks who are saying no, sure. I appreciate the forthrightness and the transparency of those answers. Do you know who lives in your state by ethnicity? 62% is saying yes, 13% no, and 25% not sure. Again, thank you for responding. And do you know who lives in your state by languages spoken? 60%, 17% no, and 23% not sure. So again, these are real critical areas if we're looking at engaging the diverse communities. Diversity is much more expansive than just race, ethnicity, and languages spoken, but those are some primary areas for councils to get started and continue the work. Thank you so much. All right, so I am going to, next slide, please. And in this slide, we're going to just quickly go over the concepts of cultural competence and linguistic competence. This framework for cultural competence has been around for quite some time, since 1989. It was created by colleagues who did work at the Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development, focused on child and adolescent mental health. I would say that this framework has been used in government, in private industry, in healthcare and education, not just in the United States, but across the world. And I think that's not by coincidence. And so as we think about cultural competence, we really indicate that an organization such as the council needs to have in place clearly defined values. And these are the values that drive their policy structures, practices, behaviors, and attitudes overall. And when we look at that, cultural competence must be reflected in each of these areas. And it's really to ensure that councils in particular are able to work effectively with whoever comes in the door. And note that this says to work effectively cross-culturally, not cross-racially. And because again, we are, as human beings, we're all cultural beings. And sometimes people mistakenly think that cultural competence are only for groups of, sometimes referred to groups of color, or persons who are in groups other than non-Hispanic white. I chose to look at cultural competence at an organizational level just because of the work of the council, but we know that cultural competence also exists at an individual level. So I'm not sure why there are check marks here on my, at least on my screen. We'll make sure that that won't be there in the PDF handout that you will receive. But cultural competent organizations have to value diversity. Can't just say it, just can't be in on a brochure or on a website. It really needs to be reflected in everything that a council, for instance, does. Councils or organizations must be able to engage in self-assessment, to look at your strengths, to see these are things that we're doing well, and then to also look at your areas for growth. We tend never to say weaknesses. We don't think that that's an affirmative way to look at where organizations are in their journey to achieve cultural competence. Really being able to manage the dynamics of difference, that would be the variety of communities, that will be persons who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities, their families, of the communities that they live. It would include staff, it would include volunteers, but being able to manage those dynamics of difference routinely in the work of the council. This next one talks about embedding cultural knowledge. You'll see the word institutionalized. That's still there because the original framer said that. We also realize that institutionalized has negative connotations overall. So I substituted the word embed, but this is saying that councils and other organizations would need to be able to acquire cultural knowledge about the groups by population and other demographic that they're serving, and to ensure that that knowledge remains within the organization. And that can be through policies, that can also be through practices, to ensure that, for instance, if someone's really excellent at working with a particular population and then they decide to leave the state, I don't know, move to Hawaii, that all of that knowledge doesn't walk out the door with them. And lastly, at an organizational level, being able to adapt to diversity, meaning that you have to revisit the things that you do at an organizational level to be able to adapt to the changing demographics within your state or territory. Cultural competence occurs at every level of an organization. And I would say that what we typically read in the literature is that folks are really focused on the practice and support services and care. That is one aspect. However, policymaking, administration, looking at individuals and families and communities are all levels that you need to touch upon if you're moving toward cultural competence within your organization. And so as I think about councils, what does this mean? This means that cultural competence is fully embedded in membership, in your state plan, and grants, advocacy, self-advocacy, and again, capacity building efforts within the councils. and that persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities or families of all backgrounds benefit from the work of the council. Cultural competence is a developmental process, and we see this across many different areas, from disability to education, health. And we know that systems, organizations, programs, agencies are at various levels of the continuum. I think what's important is that you start where you are and you continue to progress over time. I'm encouraging if you have any questions or comments about that framework, because we're going to move quickly to linguistic competence. Please put them in chat and we can revisit them. When we think about culture and we also think about language, they are linked together, and you can't have one without the other. And so as we think about linguistic competence, and we do look at linguistic competence different than what we look at in terms of cultural competence for a variety of reasons. This framework that Wendy Jones and I came up with back in 2009 really helps us to think about organizations. It's basically that any organization, whether it's a council, whether it's disability rights, whether it's University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, that all of them have to have the capacity to communicate effectively and to be able to convey information effectively to diverse groups that may benefit from the services or supports or information that's being provided. This may include people who have a limited English proficiency, which is defined in federal statute, people who may or may not be literate, either in their language of origin or in English, people who have low literacy skills as well, individuals with disabilities, and those who may be deaf or hard of hearing. So in other words, being able to communicate effectively across all of these groups is essential for a linguistically competent organization. We also look at the capacity of organizations to respond effectively to health literacy and mental health literacy. We can expand that to look at numeracy. We can expand that to look at digital literacy. There are many things that persons who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities in their families need in order to function in our society. And lastly, an organization needs to have in place policies and structures, practices and procedures to make sure that linguistically competent support services are indeed provided. I haven't in a while, but used to read sometimes grant applications, just been really too busy to do that right now. And I would see grant applications that would come in and said that they were serving, let's say, a linguistically diverse population. And then as I look through the grant, I'm looking to see what's their capacity. And oftentimes there was nothing budgeted, nor were nor were bilingual, multilingual personnel identified, and there was no resources allocated. And so I didn't grade those grants really very well. And so if we look at linguistic competence from this perspective, we're looking at all of these things to be able to communicate effectively. And so again, a way of thinking about linguistic competence is how an organization provides all of its work in languages other than English, in clear language that is easy to understand. Also, the capacity to ensure that information is provided, the capacity to interact with people who do not use speech to communicate with others, who are deaf or hard of hearing, who have difficulty reading and writing in English or in other languages, and individuals who have developmental and other disabilities. So this is a lot to do, it's a lot to take in, and to really plan for what that looks like within councils. So we want to make sure that linguistic competence is fully embedded in membership, state plan, grants, and this means approaches to your membership, state plan, grants, looking at advocacy, looking at self-advocacy and capacity building. And again, these are some examples: alternative and augmentative communication. Again, information in clear language, information in graphics, visual, audio, braille, and other formats. So these are the kinds of things that council can think about for themselves, but also when you're funding other grant opportunities, what are you requiring of those who are applying for grants to ensure that they are adhering to linguistic competence? This is just really quickly, it's giving you federal mandates for linguistic competence. It's again, if as a council, and just like our program, a University Center for Excellence in Development of Disabilities, we receive federal funding. And because we receive federal funding, we have certain obligations under the law. So again, that was just to give you an overview of cultural competence and linguistic competence. And now we're going to step into looking at community and outreach, community engagement, and distinguishing between those two. And Amy, are there any comments or questions that I need to address before we move into this?
There's nothing in the chat.
Okay, all right. So we're going to take a look at these concepts, community outreach, community engagement. And we hear these terms all the time, and I'm suggesting to you that they have very different meanings, and they also have implications for councils when engaging diverse communities. So if we think about this whole notion of community outreach and community engagement, community outreach often really focuses on an organization or an entity that maybe has information, maybe has resources, and that they are indeed literally reaching out to other communities. And it can be a very one-way perspective. If we look at community engagement, it means it's looking at things from both perspectives, that the organization may have some very valuable information or other resources to provide. And the community also has very rich resources and I'm going to say cultural knowledge that they can provide. And so if we take a viewpoint that's looking at this bilateral exchange or this two-way exchange, you get a very different outcome than if it's just one-way approach. So let's define community outreach. This is just a very simple definition. It's defined as the act of reaching out by a program or other entity for extending assistance or services to the community, especially as an act of goodwill, because, you know, we're doing this to be helpful, to be supportive, etc. If we look at community engagement, it's the process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people. And these groups of people may be affiliated by where they live within a given region, by a special interest, or similar situations. But the focus is really to affect the well-being of those people. And so we can see just by these definitions that community engagement and community outreach are really very different things. And so these are some of our guiding principles around community engagement. We believe at the National Center for Cultural Competence that community engagement looks at self-determination to the community. Communities often know what they need. They know what they want. And it's very important for us to acknowledge that as we engage them. We also know that that cultural competence requires that you're working with all levels within communities. And it could be neighborhood and civic associations. It could be local neighborhood merchants. It could be ethnic and social or faith-based organizations. But you are extending boundaries beyond those organizations that traditionally are, I'm going to say, invested in disability supports and services. So those are two things that are really very important as councils think about what are your principles and what are your values for engaging diverse communities, and that they are, I'm going to say formalized. So the council members come together to reach agreement to say, yes, these are our values and this is how we want to approach it. Another important area is looking at power dynamics, and that's between organizations and communities. So if we look at IDD service organizations, communities, and populations, that there are different levels of power within each of them. And not only are there different levels of power, there's a historical perspective, things that have happened in the past, could be 15 years ago, that councils did X, Y, and Z. That can continue to live in the life of, let's say, a particular community where someone felt rejected. And it's within that community that a particular council or organization, has not necessarily been usually friendly across diverse communities. So that historical efforts do indeed impact the present, and then potentially can impact the future in either positive and or negative ways. So as I look at these, and these are, I think, really important things to think about and to do some degree of self-examination. So sometimes IDD organizations, I'm not saying councils, and I'm not saying anyone that's on this webinar, but sometimes we only give lip service to community engagement. Sometimes we include the language of community engagement, but we don't really go about that in a culturally and linguistically competent way. And sometimes organizations fail to recognize and appreciate the knowledge and the resilience of diverse communities, because oftentimes we do needs assessments. We really do asset assessments to see what are the strengths within any given community. Sometimes we really want diverse communities that may be culturally different, but we want them to believe and think and act like us. And we know that the experience of disability is culturally defined, and it looks different for each person and within different communities. We also know for some organizations, again, I'm not talking about DD councils, that there's a lack of a capacity to learn from and partner with diverse communities, because the idea is that we're bringing something to the table. You need to accept what it is that we're bringing to the table, as opposed to that bilateral approach we talked about, the engagement part, where we're looking at learning across the board. And then sometimes organizations have few staff, particularly in leadership positions, that are representative of the communities that they serve or are seeking to serve. So these are some things to really, really think about and reflect upon your own council and community engagement. So communities should determine their own needs. Community members should be full partners in decision-making. Community should economically benefit from collaboration. I think this is super, super important, that oftentimes a grant comes in, an organization gets the grant funding, it may be, quote, directed to a particular community. No one from that community is hired, even in a very small capacity, even in terms of looking at if you're having an event and there's food that's going to be served, that you're not even contracting with vendors in that particular community or neighborhood. So again, these are some principles to really think about and reflect upon with your own council. And lastly, community engagement has to acknowledge that the transfer of knowledge of skills, that there's knowledge and skills on both sides. And this really helps with collaboration across the board. Summing this up, when we look at engaging diverse communities, that overall must be able to understand your own organization, councils, and the cultures of the staff, the diverse cultures represented within the communities that you seek to serve or are represented, the history and the social, political, and economic climates. And I'll break that down just a little bit. There's a lot going on in our country right now. It affects everyone. And understanding that environment helps you engage communities in a more effective way, because you have some knowledge of what they're experiencing. And lastly, this is really telling us that communities have strengths, and that we need to understand what those strengths are, build upon those strengths, and that they are very much interested in intervening on their own behalf. Sometimes they just need a little help. So, given that pretty detailed overview of looking at community engagement versus community outreach, so we have a polling question. Does your council differentiate community outreach from community engagement? Your answers are yes, no, don't know, or I'm working on it. And Amy, you can let me know how the responses are coming in.
Sure, we're at 61%.
All right, we can do better.
70%.
Okay, what did we go for last time?
75.
What do you think? You think we're going to make it?
We're at 73. We just might. We get a few more people to respond.
Okay, all right. Let's hold out.
We seem to have plateaued, so I'll end the poll and share the results.
All right. Okay, all right. Thank you, everybody, for responding. And sometimes we need time to process this all through, and we're going through this fairly quickly. So we have pretty much the majority of responses saying no, don't know. A large percentage says working on it right now. So again, this is an area of growth. It's not anything that's going to happen overnight, but it's really worth thinking that if you're going to engage a community, the way you choose to engage the community. And quite frankly, communities want to know, are you in this for the long haul, or are you just here for a minute? Okay, I'm going to close this. Thank you so much. And we're going to move on to the next slide. All right, we're going to talk a little bit here about historical trauma, because again, it's so important as we look at communities across the United States and in territories. I have a quote here from James Baldwin, and it describes who he is. I think it's a really, really powerful quote. History is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history we owe our frame of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And I thought that this is really, really powerful quote for a number of reasons. I am partial to the work that he's done. So just was an amazing writer, playwright, and an activist. So thinking about historical trauma is important because historical trauma often impacts the many communities in which you may be working or trying to engage. So we also hear this term minoritized a lot, and I just want to share these because I think it's important. Sometimes I'll hear when we talk about clear language that people will water down the language so much that when people hear the term again, they don't really know what it means. And I think it's important for all of us to be able to understand terms. And so as we think about this definition of minoritized, it's about social groups that have been given a different level in society. We could think about many of them, especially persons who experience disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and quite frankly, other disabilities. And so this term minoritized is really looking at not referring to people as a minority group, but to more so look at how certain groups have been treated within our society. So just want you to think about that because we're hearing this term and concept a lot. As we think about historical trauma, I'll pull from the work of of Braveheart in 1998. And it's saying that historical trauma is defined as something that happens cumulatively. It just happens over time. And it's emotional and it's psychological. And has caused harm across generations. And this would be across the lifespan. And it comes about from massive group trauma. And let's look at what that is within the community of people who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we know that some people who, again, who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities have had traumatic experiences, some of them historic and some of them present day. And so if we think about what those experiences are, it includes institutionalization. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities were placed in institutions, and there are some states that still operate institutions. We know that persons with disabilities, including intellectual and developmental disabilities, have been marginalized, they've been segregated, and they've been discriminated against in many, many arenas, not just historically, but also present day. We know that persons with disabilities are often, especially in foster care, have been in inappropriate placements and sometimes overrepresented in foster care. Many population of especially children with more significant disabilities remain in foster care, never get adopted. Then we look at this term of disproportionality. And this means that oftentimes persons with disabilities, in particular intellectual and developmental disabilities, have been placed more easily into juvenile detention centers, also into special education programs that they may not belong in overall. Other areas that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have experienced is imposed guardianship. And that this whole concept that persons with intellectual disabilities are not capable of self-determination and supported decision-making. So all of these things accumulate over time. And lastly, abuse and neglect. So that we know the whole concept of historical trauma has implications for what the council does, overall, what's happening within states, and how we engage these diverse communities. As I look at this next slide, because we all live in United States and territories, we know that there are biases, and we can't pretend that those biases don't exist within systems that support persons with intellectual and other disabilities. So this is looking at the elephant in the room. Sometimes it's hard for people to talk about it, especially I would say, in a social and political environment that we find ourselves in now, where there are such differences of points of view that sometimes people just don't even want to talk about certain issues. And so I have this elephant on the table, and I want you to check out the elephant. When I do this slide, I've been looking for elephants that looked a little serious, and I had a hard time finding them because all the elephants were cutesy and all happy and that sort of thing. So I really wanted this elephant to look super serious. And so these are all of the kind of isms that we know that happen across our country and within our states and regions and neighborhoods. And we can't ignore that these happen for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And we need to be aware of them and how it impacts them overall, especially if we're looking at community engagement. So as we talk about isms, we just look at them about a range of attitudes and beliefs and behaviors that some groups feel that they're more superior than others. And it results in oppression and prejudice and discrimination against other groups just based on who they are, their national origin, class, age, disability, sexual orientation, and or gender identity. So we know that the isms are alive and well, and it's really important for councils to be aware of that and what that means in terms of community engagement. So, like, we have another polling question. You don't have that many more left. And that is, are you knowledgeable of the historical trauma experienced by diverse communities in your state or territory? And the answers are yes, no, or had not really considered this. And Amy, you can let me know how it's coming along.
We just hit 75%, 76.
Wow, okay. All right, so I think you could show the polling results, please. All right, so most are saying that, yes, they are knowledgeable. And I really do appreciate the 12% that said had not really considered this. Again, it's being transparent. It's really looking at the work that you have been doing. Also appreciate to say, no, we just have not looked at this yet. So again, thank you for responding to these polling questions. And these are things, again, that can help ITAC in their ongoing technical assistance to councils. So I am moving to the next slide. We're going to look at this whole concept of cultural brokering, and I'm going to move things along so that we have enough time to spend with your two colleagues. So a strategy for engaging diverse community is this whole concept of cultural brokering. And these are just some images from the work that we've done in the past in this area, but it's looking at how you bridge or link or even mediate, especially if there's conflict between groups for a particular purpose. Overall, maybe to produce change. And I think that's what councils are always attempting to do. So if we look at who's a cultural broker, it just means somebody who's a go-between, who advocates with or on behalf of an individual or group. Who can be a cultural broker? It can be someone that acts as a liaison between the community and the council. It acts as a cultural guide, maybe acts as a mediator, especially if there seems to be any tension. And then also somebody who can help promote change. When we think about cultural brokers overall, that they have to have the trust and respect of the community. They have to have knowledge of what we just talked about, the historical and current experiences within these communities. They have to understand what are the values that people within this community bring to the table as it relates to intellectual, developmental, and other disabilities. And also having some idea of indigenous and natural networks of supports within these communities. Lastly, it's really important to think about persons who have intellectual and developmental disabilities often have to navigate multiple systems. And what that means, trying to navigate those multiple systems to get the supports and services that they need. And I know that councils don't directly provide supports and services, but you give recommendations to the governor. You help to influence policy. You engage in advocacy in order to really look at the interests and needs within your state as it relates to diverse groups. So we know that cultural brokering honors and respects cultural differences within communities. It's community driven. Again, it looks at reciprocal knowledge of transfer of skills. And it really works to make sure that communities economically benefit. And these are all the things that you heard previously, but this is saying that this particular approach, cultural broker, can help get you there. So I think this is your last question. Yep, it's your last polling question. Thank you for responding. So it's questions 4 and 5. Have you ever engaged with a cultural broker in your role with your DD council? Yes, no, not sure, working on it. And does your DD council have a designated position for cultural broker? And I'll wait for Amy to let us know.
We're at 58% now and still climbing.
Okay, good. Glad to hear that climbing part.
73%. Oh, 76.
Amazing. Wow, amazing. Okay, all right, we'll stop the poll now. Share results. Okay, let's see, for question number 4. So there are members of the council who have served as cultural brokers, 43%. Some are indicating no, not sure, and others are working on it right now. Again, thank you for sharing your responses. And does your council have a designated position for a cultural broker? And again, such an important role when trying to engage communities, especially those that you know very little about. So for the most part, people are either saying not sure or no, or that they're working on it. And 9% have said that they indeed have a designated position for that. It may not be called the cultural broker, but it's absolutely performing those functions. So thank you so much for answering all these questions. I think your responses are, again, going to be very, very helpful to ITAC and quite frankly to ACL, just in terms of looking at what are the kind of supports that councils need to effectively engage diverse communities in states and in territories. Okay. I think that's a extra slide. All right. 6 key approaches and strategies to engage diverse communities. We're going to go through these really very quickly, and then we're going to turn our attention to a scenario and hear from 2 of your colleagues and my colleagues as well. These are some things for you to really think about when you're engaging diverse communities. First is to learn about communities, and we've given you a lot of different areas, the demographic makeup, who lives there, what are their beliefs about developmental and other disabilities, what are their values, what are their struggles in terms of those communities. But it's really important to learn about communities overall. As you're learning about communities, and cultural brokers certainly can help, you need to be able to enter communities respectfully, meaning that there are different norms. Sometimes you just can't show up, and because you need someone within that community to introduce you, to vouch that, that you're really an okay person, or you're a really good organization to work with. But knowing these cultural norms, again, and how do you enter these communities, it's really, really very important, especially when we go to a community and we have goals that we want to achieve, and we're pushing those goals without really understanding what the community wants and needs in a specific area. So 3 says, elicit and consider the interests and needs of the communities. And notice I say interests and needs because people do have interests, and that we can't always be needs-based in terms of approaching communities. So those are 3 areas. The next one, 4, is to really look at what are areas of mutual interest and benefit. Because if you're over here and community members are over there, there has to be a way to be able to bring those together. The 5th is looking at to foster relationships that are built on mutual trust. And there's give and take on both sides and respect. And sometimes when communities have experienced historical trauma, or they're continuing to have everyday trauma, that is hard for them to perhaps engage and be trusting with certain groups that come forward. And lastly, communities find that sometimes programs, organizations, and agencies are in and out, that they have some resources and they show up this day, but next year they're gone. And so communities want to know that you're there for the long haul. And for councils, you can think about their representation, maybe not on the council, and we know that that's governor appointed, but there may be committees and other kinds of things in which they can be involved. So these are like just some lessons learned and things for you to think about in terms of engaging diverse communities. And we're going to apply what we've talked about today to a scenario. I'm going to read the scenario in just a few minutes. We have 2 council members. I'm going to say 2 colleagues and friends, Christine Pisani and Aaron Carruthers. Just going to share some ideas about this particular scenario. And I'd like at this time for them to introduce themselves to this entire webinar group. So Christine, perhaps you can go first.
Hi, I'm Christine Pisani. I am the Executive Director here at the Idaho Council on Developmental Disabilities. And thank you, Tawara, for asking me to be here today.
Thank you for agreeing to be here today. I didn't do the ask. Your colleagues did the ask, and I fully endorse the ask.
Thank
All right. All right. We'll now hear from Aaron, please.
Hi, Tawara. Hi, Christine. Hi, everybody. Aaron Carruthers, Executive Director of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities in California. I am a white male with gray hair. I have glasses on with clear frames, wearing a white shirt and a blue blazer, and behind me is a white background with the California State Council logo on it.
All right. Thank you both, Christine and Aaron. So I'm going to read this scenario, and I have a couple of questions that I will pose to Aaron and to Christine. And this is a completely made up scenario, although many of the points are borrowed from experiences that we've had at the National Center. A Developmental Disabilities Council convened an initial planning meeting for a federal grant focused on an approach to increase equity that spans the life course for persons who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. The meeting was attended by key constituency groups, and I am using the term constituency groups as opposed to stakeholders. That's a whole other story, but we are not using the term stakeholder because of its history and that it has caused harm, historical harm to groups. So that's why we're using constituency groups. It was attended by key constituency groups from across the state. Council members and staff were unprepared for the tension that emerged among constituency group representatives about their belief systems and what constitutes equity. Representatives, again from these groups, stated, because of smaller populations, their communities do not receive equitable attention and resources compared to other racial and ethnic groups in the state. These representatives also said persons with intellectual and developmental disability as an entire group are underserved, and there should be no differences based on race, ethnicity, and income, because that's the opposite of equity, according again to this group, and that the state IDD system has historically discriminated against specific groups based on race, ethnicity, cultural language, leading to these power differentials within the state's IDD system. So these are things that were stated. So we're going to hear from Christine and Aaron, and we're going to ask them really to think about those 6 approaches, and then to look at these 2 prompts. If we look at the scenario, what were the differing lived experiences and worldviews among the participants in this initial planning meeting? And then looking back, how could council members and staff have prepared for this meeting overall, and perhaps anticipated some of this? So let's hear from you.
Thank you, Tawara. And I also would like to just share that I am a white woman wearing a pink linen shirt with black framed glasses. And in my background are the beautiful Sawtooth Mountains in the state of Idaho. I will start by just saying that I'm going to use the example of rural remote communities in Idaho and the Latino community that we work with here in Idaho. And I'm going to start with commonalities, at least in our state. And for those two particular populations, what we find that they have in common in Idaho is that there is almost, I would say, no services for both those communities. They are well underrepresented as far as having a voice in shaping policy for the developmental disability community, have very little access, very little transportation within those communities. And I think a commonality would be that they would both say that they feel either left behind or completely left out. So in using the keys that Tawara has spoken to, I would say that the perspective that we've taken is that we really began with the concepts of asset-based community development practice. And that practice really has informed the way that we go both in as a humble student to both communities, really not knowing anything, but spending time intentionally listening to those communities and having them help us understand what the needs are. And I would say directing us as far as what needs to happen, because we don't have that experience and we're looking to those communities to help inform us about the areas that they need support to lead in making those changes. And in that process, I would say that we do that by looking to the community members to find leaders, and that's through the intentional listening. And those conversations helped us to identify community leaders that helped us gain trust. That could be through a cultural broker, which we have used to assist us, but also connecting with those community organizations that help us to inform ourselves about those specific communities, as well as access to people and gaining the trust through either those agencies or community leaders within those separate communities. And as a minimum allotment state, we're always trying to figure out where are the commonalities so that we can meet as many people's needs as possible that are experiencing the same types of exclusion or areas that need work. And to do this work, we started with a cultural broker and then decided that we needed our own in-house Native community members who were also bilingual to help us do a deeper, more meaningful job of doing this work. So the only other comment that I would make about answering the question about looking back, how could council members and staff have prepared for this meeting, is that I think that it often helps to create safer spaces to host meetings that are separate. So for example, we might just meet with the Latino community because that creates a safer space and gives them an opportunity to speak more freely, of course, once we've developed that trust. And the same with rural remote communities in our state. So I hope that helps give you a framework of how we've used the 6 keys that Tawara has described in doing the work here in Idaho.
Thank you so much, Christine. I am particularly struck that you looked at commonalities between these two communities, that people wouldn't think that there would be many commonalities shared. So I just want to be able to comment on that. And the fact that you have used cultural brokering, and that you didn't necessarily call them values, but you really did articulate values and principles that help frame how you're going to work within these communities. And I just want to highlight that this is really very important, and to give Erin a chance to comment overall in terms of what you just shared.
Thank you, Tawara. Did you want me to comment on Christine's? Or
Yeah, if you want to, before we go to your responses, yeah.
how unfair? Only if Christine gets to comment on mine after I speak. But
She will.
what I really appreciate about the work that's happening within Idaho is that Christine and her council and their leadership are being led by their community, and the community through the council members themselves. So Christine has a really robust and diverse council, and the council members as cultural brokers themselves for the community are leading this push where Christine is able to then access parts of the state that might be difficult otherwise.
All right. Okay. I just thought you wanted to give her a shout out. So I was just telling you it was okay to do that.
My
right.
Zoom thinks I am speaking Arabic. I just got a little message popped up. Speaking of language access, sounds like I'm speaking. Confirm your speaking language. It sounds like you might have switched to a different language. Please confirm that you are speaking Arabic. So if I am mumbling or not coming through clearly, let me know. With Christine and Idaho's focus on Spanish-speaking and Latino families, we could discuss that here in California because California still has entrenched power differentials and inequities that are very deep. There's the most acute disparities in access to dollars and services when looking at Californians who are Latino, Hispanic, Spanish-speaking. I mean, the reality is that 55 years ago, largely upper middle class white families came together to advocate for California's system. And the question California needs to keep asking itself is, why is it that the system still seems to more fully benefit, more fully serve the same demographic 55 years later? And looking at the prompt, I think what's really fascinating is the question about what's equitable, what's equal, and what's historical. And oftentimes these three factors exist together. When I read this prompt, I didn't see this as I'm in a community forum and three different points of view showed up. I read it as I'm in a community forum and single individuals or single perspectives are showing up, experiencing all three of these values at the same time. And applying it to California, there's two that come to mind that I want to apply to, and it's not typically what people think of when they think of California. The first is California's frontier, rural, politically conservative Californians. So, fun fact, in the last presidential election, Californians cast the most votes for Donald Trump out of any state in the country. Not what you think of when you typically think of California. But these are still true, living in California, and there's parts of the state that want to secede from the state and form their own state called the state of Jefferson. This is true. Feel free to Google it. And from their point of view, there's a fundamental value of equality. All sources should be given and delivered the same. There's also an experience of the need for equitability because they're in areas where there aren't the services, aren't the access that's needed to get the services. They look at more urban areas where services are concentrated. There's also a sense of historical discrimination because of their political views or their physical location within California. Another group to look at or how to apply it would be California's First People. So the US government reports there are 109 federally recognized Indian tribes in California, and several more who are petitioning for recognition from the US Bureau of Indian Affairs. Again, not what people think of when they think of California, of having this very diverse existence of sovereign tribal nations. But that sentence alone, like I could just pause and we could spend the rest of the time just talking about that sentence alone, that the US government reports there are 109 federally recognized tribes and some more petitioning for recognition. Well, if we're using the keys, we got to pause and just to learn about communities. To exist, my existence depends upon somebody else's acknowledgement within this physical space. That's where we start when we're entering communities with Native communities. And to enter the communities, it is just, it's usually a not necessarily a cultural broker, but an introduction. So I'm in a Northern California rural area that has, and I'm at a meeting related to education. And there happens to be somebody else at the meeting who's Native American related to education. And we're just both there about education. And we're working together and finding commonality and agreements about values around education. From that may come an introduction outside of that county board of education setting to something that's more specific within the tribe. From the introduction, just being present, showing up consistently to wherever I'm introduced has gone a long way within our initial outreach. Interestingly, the way the patterns happen among tribes is that our presence and consistency within tribal spaces we were invited to in Northern California was communicated to tribes in Southern California and lent significant weight and access to when we put a grant out. There is a different tribe in Southern California who's experiencing developmental disabilities among their children, at 3 out of 5 children being born with a developmental disability. And from that, they applied for one of our grants. What they wanted to do was to develop culturally relevant milestones information and also IEP information. So meetings up there, traveled down there, and then the products have been produced. So now the products have been produced and we're in the space of, we're not the cultural brokers, but there is somebody who's contracted and experienced with us who is then excited, and all the tribes are churning to that entity in that single tribe to say, what did you learn? How did that go? And what can we learn from you? That doesn't mean that we are now have access to or creating relationships with many more tribes. What it means is that we're waiting to see if that tribe or another tribe, if we have something they want that's going to value them based on their priorities. So that is an experience of, and from that, there is certainly an equity need of 3 out of 5 children. There is certainly not an expectation of equality from tribes that resources will be shared equally, but there is certainly entrenched power differentials and historical discrimination that is being navigated by conversation by conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Aaron. And I'm going to ask Christine, is there anything you'd like to share with Aaron in terms of the overview that he shared with us and some of the very specific kinds of works in which they are engaged?
Well, I just want to comment that I think what Aaron shared speaks to the intentionality of the long-term commitment to this type of work that it takes in order to gain the type of trust that he described that happened because of the relationships they built in the north that traveled to the south, that allowed them basically an opportunity to begin to work with tribes in the southern part of the state. And I think that not only has Aaron done this in the Native American community, but he's also done this in the Latino community, for which the Idaho Council has been able to benefit from the expertise within his state to help our state develop that expertise. And I think that level of commitment and longstanding commitment to those communities is clearly evident in the work that they've been able to do in serving those communities. So
Okay.
Thank you, Aaron.
And I want to thank Aaron and also thank you. And I'm also keeping an eye out on the time. So Amy, I only have one other slide, which is a closing slide. So we're pretty good there. What I heard Aaron also talk about, as well as Christine, was the social, cultural, and political environment, because it always is there. And it's always there and it's there from history to present, and it affects the future. Also really recognizing different points of view within people who live in California about what's more important, equality or equity. Also looking at, when we take a look at our DD systems, many of which have been developed over years, who were those systems initially designed for? And who's trying to access those systems now? And then lastly, I heard from Aaron about these communities economically benefiting, so that there was this grant structure. So I think that a lot was shared. And I think that these kind of conversations between and among council members, all looking to essentially do the same work, meet the interests and needs of persons who experience intellectual and developmental disabilities within your state, across race, across ethnicity, across geographic locale, across socioeconomic status, gender identity, and expression. And, how can we continue these dialogues? And so what I'm going to do really very quickly is to share my last slide. Where is it? Okay. And all right, here it is. And I probably didn't have it in the correct mode. Is everyone able to see this slide?
No,
Amy?
we can.
No. I'm not, okay, I'm gonna read it. Okay. All right. Sometimes I'm a tech challenge person. So this slide is saying words of wisdoms for engaged in diverse communities. It has an image of Maya Angelou, and it says this: prejudice is a burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible. And I think that's something really very powerful, that our work, even though it's present day, is indeed rooted in things that have happened in the past, and that we have to take that in consideration. So I will stop now. We have about 4 minutes remaining. I don't know if we have any time for questions. I also know that there's an additional polling question that I saw Amy put in the chat. So I thank you for joining us this afternoon. At least this afternoon here. It's probably afternoon now on the West Coast as well. And for really spending time to take a deep dive into a really very, very important area. I thank all the folks at ITAC and at ACL for giving us this opportunity to spend this time with you.
Thank you so much, Tawara. I did launch the final poll, so if you would please answer the questions, that would be great. We do have a couple of minutes left. I'm not sure if anybody has a question for Tawara. She might be able to take one or two. Close it out.
Happy to take any questions. Don't know if anything's in chat. Question or comment or anything.
Daintree from Hawaii had a nice comment in the chat thanking you for your third question in your scenario. She said that knowing what cultures have gone through was very important for us during the COVID outbreak and vaccinations. Citizens from the Compact of Free Association states rightfully had a mistrust due to the way they were treated following the thermonuclear weapon tests. And then, of course, how the Hawaiians were treated. So thank you again for that question.
Thank you for making that link.
Let's see. Someone asked, when the polls are asked, the questions in your polls, what percentage usually tell the truth?
I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not clairvoyant. I do not know. All right. However, we do use polling a lot. And what I'm encouraged by are the polls that say, not too sure we're doing this. And, it's up to other people. And let's see, I'm going to say it's up to each person because they're responding in their own belief systems. I'm going to give them a nod and say, I expect that they're telling their own truth in their own way.
Someone has asked if you would share the Maya Angelou quote source.
Yes, it's in the slide. It's in the slide deck. I
Okay.
really do apologize for that. It's you could just actually Google quotes on Maya Angelou and prejudice. That's what I did, and it came up.
Great. And the slides will be available on our website. Let's see. Allison White asks, do you have thoughts on how to approach situations where you're working with people who aren't understanding their position of power or privilege and how it affects their engagement with communities?
So Allison, you're talking about a whole other workshop or course, right?
I'll take it. I'll show up for that one too.
I think it's hard for people to look at themselves in terms of that they may have benefited from a system that's in place and to see that as privilege. So I don't know that we can make anyone see it. However, there's a lot of things to help people increase their awareness. And Allison, like we can talk. We can talk about that. I've done a lot of this internally at Georgetown for really looking at a racial equity learning community. So we have some resources to be able to share with you.
And Christine has her hand raised.
Thank you. My question for you, Tawara, is that I had the extreme fortune of being part of an immersion training for a week that I got to spend with you and others from Georgetown. This was sponsored by ACL at the time, and that was life-changing for me. I got to go with my Idaho PNA, my USED, and I just think that that would be so beneficial to be able to provide that again. And I know that it was because they had some additional funding at the time, but I'm always pushing this because it created a huge change in my thinking that has impacted the duration of my work here at the council. And I'm just wondering if you could provide some comments about how we might be able to get that back again.
Okay, first of all, thank you for that. It was an amazing experience, and it actually was the brainchild of Allison Cruz, who really wanted to look at focusing on leadership and addressing disparities. So we were happy to have an opportunity to be able to do that in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we put our values in place by contracting with a primarily Native American-owned hotel that was small, that was used to us being there and conducting courses. We would love to do that again, any kind of opportunity, because we do need leadership in this space. And I think, and I'm going to put this out there, I think that sometimes there are those individuals who only think that efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion, cultural and linguistic competence can be led by, quote, people of color. I don't believe that in terms of it can only be limited to a group. We need leaders, period, across the whole spectrum in order to do this work. So should an RFP opportunity come up again, we'd be happy to apply again as we did before.
Thank you, Tawara.